Hey guys, welcome to this week's podcast episode. I've got a really fantastic guest, Stephen Reiff, and he's going to talk to us all about strategy, corporate strategy, management consulting. He's got an MBA from the UVA Darden School of Business, and it's going to be a fascinating discussion about corporate culture and the material around that. So, Stephen, welcome.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. Very excited. So thanks for having me on, Chris.
Yeah, tell people about your story and your background and what you do, and we'll get started.
Yeah, great. So, my story, I guess I can start back. I'm born and raised in Portland, Oregon. I live in Dallas, Texas now. I miss the beauty of Oregon, but I do not miss the rain. And I started my career in corporate strategy and management consulting. I did a brief stint in politics, so I can talk about working on a presidential campaign. And when we lost the election, I did not work in the White House. I went to business school and worked in consulting, and eventually went to go work in-house where I led corporate strategy. And I'm happy to unpack what is strategy. Strategy can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. And then through my experience with strategy, I realized it doesn't matter what your strategy is if no one knows what it is, if employees don't know what it is, if board members don't know what it is, if investors don't know what it is. And if, I know you have a doctor audience, if your patients don't know what your treatment strategy is, it really doesn't matter what your strategy is. And so then we added on, corporate communications, which is the mechanism to start telling the story of your strategy. And so after that experience and seeing the magic of when you combine strategy and communication, I decided to start my own firm. I created a firm that I wished had existed. So we sit at the intersection of management consulting to help create the strategy, and then PR firms and executive comms to help tell the story of the strategy. And there's very few firms that have kind of both of those skill sets.
Yeah, interesting. So kind of break down or just high level overview of strategy, corporate strategy, how it applies to, presidential campaigns and looking into that.
Great. So strategy, the definition of a strategy, I say, is just a fancy word for a plan. And I like to think of it as or priorities. So when you think of the word strategy, think of plan, think of priorities. And I think you can put it in everyday life. Did you go on a vacation this summer, Chris?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. So you probably had a goal in mind. Do I need a rest? Interviewing all these boring podcast guests, I'm just kidding, we're exciting, is exhausting and I need to rest. And so you probably put together a plan or a strategy of I need to rest, therefore I'm going to prioritize finding a beach vacation, et cetera, et cetera. Or if you have kids, you're I need a priority. My goal is to educate my kids. And so I'm putting a plan together to go to Europe. We're going to go to all these different museums. And so really it depends on your objective. If your objective is to rest, you put together a plan for one thing. If your objective is to educate your kids, you put together a plan. And strategy is just the same thing. You have an objective, and then you need to put a plan together. And then you need to stick to that plan, and you need to execute it. So my wife and I'm a big believer that everybody is a strategist. If you're a doctor, you're a strategist. If you're an entry-level analyst, you're a strategist. Everyone needs to be able to put a plan together. So my wife and I have one for our family. We have a 3-point strategy. We're both nerdy. She's an MBA as well. And we talk about our priorities for the year. How are we going to spend our time? What do we want to prioritize? And then companies do the same thing. We live in a world with very limited resources. And so what are the 3 to 4 things we want to focus on? And then strategy is very scalable. So if you want to focus on improving your customer experience, then you have three things in order to improve the customer experience. And then from there's 3 things. And so it can be very, very scalable as well. So that's strategy kind of in a nutshell.
And what about this idea of corporate communications? I've always been interested, how they decide what messaging to use and the framework messaging. How does that work?
Yeah. So it's a great question. I mean, I think everything you communicate is a function of the strategy. So every press release I write, it's how is this little press release? How is this partnership? How is this product? How does that fit into the bigger picture of where the company is going? So, when the CEO writes the press release or writes this quote, it's as part of our strategy to do X, we are excited to announce our partnership with Y. And so the corporate communications piece is really, articulating how the CEO, how the company is executing their strategy and building and growing, and everyone's going to be happy. If you look at the data in different studies, one of the perennial complaints of any executives is they don't communicate enough. And especially in this hybrid workforce environments, it's added a lot more curveballs into executive communications. There's some study I think PwC did that's talked about how 90% of employees don't understand the company's strategy. And if the employees don't understand it, they're probably working on the wrong things. They may not be bought in to the future of the company. So that's kind of the interplay, if you will, between strategy and corporate communications. And then when you think about communications, you think about internal audiences, and then you think about external. And I think a lot of people, it's been interesting. Somewhat of what I do is PR, and people have this mindset of like, oh, PR, that's kind of like a celebrity type of a thing. And that's like kind of slimy and kind of squishy. And I want to change the narrative and say, hey, it's actually about how can you authentically tell your story, and just being more proactive about it as well. And it can actually be a tool to help increase, company value. And it's not just about, making somebody famous or being a publicist for Prince Harry or whatnot. So I think people need to change their anchor point on PR. How it's a squishy thing over here. It's actually it can really complement the hard numbers, because if your business is cranking out good results, well, it's even better if those numbers are then tied to your strategy and what you're driving. As well. An interesting analogy. I believe analogies are the key to communication. And so I think have you watched the show Survivor? Do you remember that show? Okay. Yeah, well, it's on for 40 seasons. I didn't know. I watched it growing up, and then all of a sudden my friend's like, it's still on. And I was like, what? But it's a great example of both strategy and communications, because each player needs to have a strategy. But if they don't communicate at the end to the journey, how their strategy got them to that seat, it doesn't matter, what their strategy is. So you really need both. And vice versa, if all you do is communicate, but then you didn't really have a plan, it's going to be hard to put lipstick on a pig, if you will.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And we'll talk about PR, which you alluded to. But how does management consultant fit into this strategy, communication, and what can they do? Kind of decipher that.
Yeah. I think, management consulting, at the end of the day, consulting is you're hired to give advice and you're hired for your expertise. And so I think, and sometimes that outside perspective is really, really helpful. There's a phenomenal book called Range, which I encourage your listeners to get. It's by David Epstein. And one specific example of that I love to show is actually use like a research study to prove that objective opinions are very helpful. But they gave students a oil and gas company and said, come up with a strategy for their oil and gas company. And with one group, they only gave other oil and gas company benchmarks. Like with another group, they gave other energy benchmarks. And another group, they said, look at the strategy of Nike and McDonald's and an airline. And the participants who looked at those seemingly random strategies that aren't related to oil and gas actually came up with the most interesting and innovative and successful strategy for the oil and gas company. And so consultant, they all they do is bring objective advice and hopefully bring some level of expertise. To bring it to, I know your physician background. I heard one consultant described himself like, well, if you're having heart surgery, you need the best heart surgeon in America to do it. And I was like, maybe, but like, there's a lot of heart surgeons that can perform heart surgery. Like, I think I would be okay with. He was kind of making the case of like, you always need the best. And it's like, I think there's actually a lot of heart surgeons that could do it. But so I can make fun of the industry a little bit as well, even though I'm part of it.
Interesting. And talking about PR, you have this idea of board level PR strategy and top PR priorities on where to play and how to win. I'm just curious to get more insight into the PR.
When we talk about where to play and how to win, I think that's part of the strategy and part of the PR too, because every strategy is like, what markets are you going to play in? What industry are you going to play in? What services are you going to play in? And then how are you going to win? I've sat next to a lot of CEOs who are asked questions by investors, and it's all, how are you different? How are you better? And so when you're thinking about the company level strategy, you need to answer those questions of how are you going to win? How are you better than the competition? And the same thing with the PR world. Like, it's a very noisy world. There's a lot of journalists. It's tough to be a journalist. I want to start a journalist support group because they're like tasked with writing 1 to 2 articles per day. And it's a tough life. And all that to say is that anyways, I forget where I was going, but you want to make their lives easier, and they're trying to figure out how they can win and stand out kind of in this noisy world that we're in. And so I almost have like the Jerry Maguire, help me help you. If you're writing a story, how can I help provide content? And it's not, I think the old way of PR was to say, hey, look at me, I'm special. And like, no one cares. I mentioned Prince Harry before. Like if people actually care about Prince Harry, all he has to do is wake up in the morning and people cover it. But for the rest of us, like no one really cares about Steven. Like my mom does, I guess. But what they do care, and why I'm on this show is, right, you're interested in the insights that I have that point to the bigger picture that can, and so it's the same way with the PR world, in the sense of like PR firms don't care about specific companies, but they care about how your company is indicative of broader trends. And that's where I think people need to change their perception of like, hey, people aren't going to cover you just because like you think you're interesting. They're going to cover you if you can have a helpful insight to the broader macro trends of how the world is, how the world's changing. So that's how I advise my clients. It's just like, I can't say like it's hard to sell you, but like, let's come up with ideas on like where your thought leadership is, and then let's press into that.
Yeah. I've always been fascinated with this this area. You also have this section on where you talk about reporting and metrics and kind of decipher that for us.
Yeah, I think part of that's, again, me wanting to change the narrative of PR. I think a lot of people think of it as a soft skill, and I think it can be the hard skills. PR firms should not run away from numbers. They should embrace them, and they should embrace them twofold. They should embrace them on what are the numbers the story is telling for the company, and then they should be not afraid to report and use metrics on their own performance and how they're performing. I've actually read a book, and I love the saying is like, numbers are narrative. Numbers are telling a story as well. Every PR firms traditionally, are more poet. I talk about Arvo is combining the poets and the quants. So I think numbers are an important part of the storytelling puzzle, if you will, especially for CEOs. So, yeah. And I've seen it some too with, my daughter's had some health issues lately. So we spent a lot of time in the hospital. And I know, you're a doctor. And so they're looking over her numbers, right? And they're literally printing it out on the piece of paper. And then they're telling us the story of the numbers. And it's a, different example, but it's just another way of like articulating and kind of looking for examples in your everyday life, whether it's vacations or as you're treating patients. It's like the numbers are telling you something. Her hemoglobin levels are something, and what is the trend? How are they going? It's the same thing for doctors. It's the same thing for CEOs. And so that's like, I guess, another way I would try to, speak to your constituents and your background a little bit.
Yeah, interesting. And, earlier on in your bio, you were talking about how you worked on a presidential campaign. I'm sure that was quite a really interesting experience. You get to learn, all this campaign finance strategy, communications. And then if someone's interested in management consulting, does an MBA help, or, what kind of training? Tell more.
MBA is very helpful to transition into consulting. They're notoriously hard. It's hard to get jobs in management consulting. And then for the top MBA programs, all the consulting firms come to you, which is really great. So if your goal is to transition into management consulting, I do recommend going to an MBA program, not just anyone. You have to like do your due diligence and make sure that those consulting firms that you want to work for are coming to campus. But it can be one of the best pipelines, to enter consulting industry. Yeah. And the consulting firms are recruiting more MDs recently too. So some of them are liking the more diverse backgrounds.
Yeah, a couple of my physician colleagues, they're working for Deloitte and Bain, and how can people contact you, follow you, check out your work, reach out to you?
Thanks. Yep. Website Arvo. Arvo is the name of my firm. I'm a big fan of Viore, the clothing company. And I read an article about them, about how they looked to Scandinavian languages to find their name. So it means valuation. Arvo means value or valuation, because that's at the end of the day, like strategy plus story equals your valuation. So that's the name of my firm. And I'm on LinkedIn as well, Stephen Reiff, R-E.
Yeah. And for all the audience out there, let's thank Stephen for coming out to the show, really providing insights into a really interesting sector and industry, and all of his resources will be in the links and show notes. And thanks so much for coming out to the podcast.